So, thanks for coming. Changing Tides is the next session about building diverse and inclusive coffee communities. We were going to title this conversation Free Pizza so that we could ensure that everyone gets in the room and that they're really excited about the topic, but then it was scheduled for right after lunch, and I knew that you would all be really full, so we decided to not do that. So Changing Tides is the title that we've chosen for the conversation on building equity, diversity, and inclusion into the coffee industry and in coffee communities and coffee businesses, because I really wanted to locate us within current movements, and that's a pun as well. But in the time of Black Lives Matter, when we see over and over again how coffee spaces, cafes, and the coffee industry exclude people of color, and I'm not just talking about the events that happened in Philadelphia this past weekend. This is a coffee problem. It's not one single business's problem, right? Coffee cafes are seen generally as the first wave of gentrification into predominantly low-income and Black or people of color communities. So that situates coffee within that current movement. And in the time of legislation, which is prohibiting individuals from access to public restrooms because they don't identify as the gender that they were assigned at birth, the SCA comes under fire from its LGBTQ members and allies because of gaps in policies and procedures that led to discrimination and exclusion from events. And in a time of Me Too and Time's Up, a prominent third-wave coffee roaster in San Francisco settled a high-profile lawsuit for sexual harassment and sexual assault. And in this case, they actually changed their name to The Tide before changing it back to 4-Barrel. So, thinking about the tides and thinking about how these current movements are going to continually pull us like gravity, and how we need to navigate them in order for the rising tide to lift all ships. That's what this conversation is about. It's also kind of differentiates us from this concept of waves, and to borrow from my good friend Trish, we've done that already. We've completed the third wave, and she, at a recent coffee event, congratulated us all because we've done it. We have focused on individual experience, individual choice. We have focused on conscious consumerism with quality and authenticity as drivers to offset structural inequalities throughout the world. And we're the first to pat ourselves on the back for that in many instances. But what we need to consider is how many people we're leaving out of that conversation for identifying what the coffee industry is and what our objectives are, what are our goals, and what are our tactics. And so, if you think about people of color, if you think about women, gender nonconforming folks, trans folks, people that can't speak English, even people that speak English as a second language, these are individuals that have lived experience, that have things to contribute to the conversation of what it means to succeed in the coffee industry and what it means to be a leader in the coffee industry. And they have historically and predominantly been excluded from that conversation. So tides and the change of the tides really in this situation is one about dominant power structures. Right, and we've heard that a lot throughout the morning, that what's happening right now and where we see a lot of the grassroots movements in the coffee culture, especially in America, and predominantly in America, is focused around changing these dominant power structures so that voices and perspectives can be included. And you can listen to a recording from the 2017 lecture at SCA, which I believe was even called Changing Power Structures or Changing Power Dynamics in the Coffee Industry, where the 7 people on that panel, 6 of whom are actually presenting over the course, this morning and then throughout tomorrow, because they have great perspectives, they are the first to tell you that if you haven't seen these concepts manifest in the periphery of your business or in the broader coffee industry, then you're not paying attention. And if you're not paying attention, there's really no option anymore. You must pay attention to the conversations that are happening in the margin. So, that's sort of the question for all of us here is, how do we do that, right? What tools do we need? How can we survive? How can we analyze our gaps, the gaps in our policies and our procedures that foster discrimination? How do we support marginalized voices in a way that, that values them and that allows people to contribute to conversations that shape the future of our industry? And so that's what this session is supposed to do. And so there's me as a little coffee bean in a boat. And that coffee bean is anyone that feels lost and feels like they're drowning in this conversation. So the first thing that I want to do to set us up for the rest of the session is to talk a little bit about marginalization. And the dominant, the definition that I'm going to use is marginalization is the process of pushing a particular group or groups of people to the edge of society or an organization or a coffee industry by not allowing them an active voice, identity, or place within it. And when we talked about this concept on the call with the panelists last week, Isabella from Brazil said, I had to look up this concept. I had to look at a definition in Portuguese, and it's a very harsh and it's a very violent definition. We use this for people that are criminals in our society and people that we don't value. And me, as someone that's a white person, I was like, I don't think maybe in my head I was like, I don't think it's that harsh because I'm super desensitized to this. This is stuff that I've studied for many years. But Tamika, a black woman that's living in New York City and is an immigrant to the United States from Belize, she said, no, you're absolutely right, Isabella. This is very violent. It's a very chaotic process. And it's one that, in many cases is a matter of life or death for some people. So we have to think about marginalization much more in terms of space. And it's both physical and mental space, where your kind of the culture of an organization or the culture of an industry is really seen. You look at sort of what is normal, what you define as normal about your culture. And those people that identify with those concepts of what is normal within a culture reinforce those conceptions through procedures and laws and institutions, policies, social networks, a lot of times, and support. And those that do not identify with those concepts of normal are pushed off to the side. Right? And so the people that are kind of outside of that sphere, they have to think about their proximity to what is normal. So in the United States, it's predominantly, what's normal is considered white, male if you were born male or assigned male at your birth, and heterosexual. Let's just throw some of those out there for you, right? So those that don't identify as heteronormative or cisgendered male or white, they always have to think about their actions within that sort of proximity to what is normal. And so what we see in coffee right now is that there are a number of grassroots organizations and whisper networks that are focusing on each other, that are amplifying their voice, that are finding pathways to offset or to upset the dominant power structures in coffee right now. And this is just a handful of examples. And what's cool about this is there are a number of people that founded these grassroots networks that are actually in the room today. So diversity consultants, if you hire one for your organization, they'll probably start with an exploration of what is unconscious bias. And you might see in the news that Starbucks just announced that they are going to close a number of stores for racial bias training or unconscious bias training. And that is typically the sort of assumptions or attitudes that you hold when you make decisions based on those, right? And it's a lot of times unconscious, and it's a lot of times unfounded. And the way that you have to start considering, an exploration of what your unconscious bias is. And a really interesting thought experiment that Phyllis Johnson posed last year on that panel that I told you about was if you had a handful of marbles and they were all different sorts of colors and you dropped them on the floor, it would be statistically improbable for all of the green ones to segregate into the corner of the room. So, you have to think about this and think about, well, in all of the years of the World Barista Championships, why has there never been a female-identified winner, champion, right? You have to think about, on a 20-person board of a 10,000-member association, why is 70% of that male? Why is 85% of that white? Why is 90% of that heteronormative? Right? We have to explore that. I'm not trying to drag anybody, but I'm trying to say that, we have to invite this self-reflection and self-criticism in order to change the institutions that are reinforcing these things. So a couple of other concepts that you'll hear throughout the rest of this session that I just want to set us up for, because I want to focus on the message and not necessarily the concepts. We'll start with privilege. It's a very triggering term, I know, for many people. But if you think about that illustration that was before about proximity to normal, privilege is essentially the advantages that you have because of that, right? So as a white woman, pretty much, it's not anything that I do necessarily. It's just kind of the way that the way that I exist. I can just show up and breathe and benefit from being in a predominantly white space. Intersectionality is multidimensional and overlapping discrimination. So using myself as an example, right? So I am a woman. There's a certain amount of discrimination that's already against me, but I'm a queer woman. And so in a predominantly heteronormative space, I constantly have to think about how I present myself and the things that I say, because I'm different. Right? I'm constantly thinking about how I'm different, how I'm perceived differently, and how do I change or code switch so that I can show up in a way that my message is the thing that's listened to and valued, and people aren't just questioning my experience or questioning who I am as an individual. Another story about this is after the Women's March in 2017 in DC, a white male friend of mine was flipping through my Instagram feed. And he said, "Why are there Black Lives Matter protesters at the Women's March?" And I was like, well, because the experiences of black women in America are not the same as white women in America, right? It's the same. It's why we don't stop at this concept of 77 cents on a dollar for wage inequality, because that's very much a white reality. It's not the reality of a black woman. It's not the reality of an Asian American woman. It's not for a Latina or an immigrant. So we have to think about these overlapping forms of discrimination, because everyone is different and everyone has different barriers to success. Emotional labor. So thinking about how I need to position myself within that normative space, that's extremely taxing, right? And I already said that I have to think about that all the time and how I show up and how I present myself, right? So I call this, you could call it taxing, but I call it over-extracted by the ignorance of actually considering me as an individual and a human that has something to contribute. But also under-extracted, right? So I think Michelle said last year on that panel that, imagine the sort of innovation that would happen in this space if I could just show up and contribute, and that I didn't have to justify my existence, basically, or justify my resume. Microaggressions is another term that you'll hear, and it's just kind of a reminder that you are different, right? So it's a gender nonconforming person in your workspace, and you address them in a group of people as guys. Or you are a white person and you're code switching to African American vernacular English when you're around your black friends. It's these sort of things that actually remind those individuals of their difference. So now we're going to switch to a panel where we're going to discuss inclusive businesses. And then Michelle Johnson is going to give a talk on some of the policies that she's enacted with the support of her teammates at Barista Hustle. for more inclusive conversations. And then we're going to finish with a panel on how to have uncomfortable conversations and how to position ourselves in it. So for the rest of the session, it'd be great to think about entering into this space. You are supposed to be uncomfortable. You're supposed to examine your identities and your benefits. So here's a little primer on how to engage in uncomfortable conversations. And it's this little acronym, CLAIM. So center yourself and think about your privilege. Think about where you exist in that proximity to normal. Listen to the experiences, the actual lived experiences and perspectives of the people, and value what they're telling you. Acknowledge their contribution. These people, they have lives, and they have other experience that they would probably love to talk to you about and their expertise, but they're here to give us all a primer on privilege and on uncomfortable conversations and on marginality. So acknowledge that this is a really great emotional work that they're doing. Inquire if you have the consent of these individuals or anyone else that you think wants to engage in this type of conversation tomorrow or in the coffee breaks. Ask them, but value their value and make sure that you have their consent. And finally, move forward. And the best way to move forward is changed behavior. So with that, we are going to call up our first panel. So we have Kimberly Eason, who's the Strategic Director of the Partnership for Gender Equity, Doug Hewitt, who is the co-founder of 1951 Coffee in Berkeley, California, Jen Chen, who is a coffee marketer, a writer, and a photographer out of San Francisco, California, and Isabella Pascual, who is the Sustainability and Impact Manager of doTERRA Farms. So welcome them. Great, everyone. Hi, welcome. Thanks for joining. I'm just going to pull up these questions real quick. So what we're going to do is start with a sort of an introduction to your businesses for the audience. So what we want to do is talk about, sorry about that. So I would really love to hear from each of you about your business goals and the values that you hold as a business. And then also, why did you build a business that prioritizes the inclusion of marginalized communities? So we'll start with you, Kimberly.
Great. Thanks, Colleen. The Partnership for Gender Equity, we believe strongly that gender equity is the foundation for sustainability in the supply chain. And so when we talk about marginalized communities, we're talking about women, youth, and essentially coffee farming families, workers, all of those people who, as Colleen mentioned in the introduction, really don't have a voice and frequently are left out of conversations. We focus on origin, in particular, small farmer households and producer organizations, but also recognize that the issue resonates throughout the whole coffee value chain. I think many of us are trained in this sector to think about a coffee farmer as an individual, a male, and not necessarily think about who are those other people in the household. And all of those people have different concerns, different aspirations, and different skills and different talents and different ways of interacting around coffee and their lives. And as an industry, we can be much more successful in addressing some of the challenges that we've been looking at during the day by taking into account all of those different needs and perspectives and opportunities just to build a much stronger supply chain. So we're working with a research focus and really working to bring a cross-industry collaboration to try to elevate the issue so that we can have a transformative impact on the sector that doesn't necessarily take generations to take root, right? That we can actually try to have an impact in a much shorter amount of time that we can actually see as we work together towards a better future for the sector.
Thanks. Hi, Doug.
So 1951 Coffee Company derives its name from the year 1951, when the United Nations first kind of came together to define the term refugee. and to set out the protections and the legal rights that refugees should have as they flee their home countries. As a coffee company, we train baristas arriving in the United States, or train refugees to be baristas when they first arrive in the United States, and we help find placements for them in the coffee industry, primarily in the Bay Area, but also in San Diego right now. We have our own cafe where we employ 10 people right now, and part of the reason that we do what we do, Rachel Tabor, the other co-founder, and I both used to work at the International Rescue Committee, one of the leading refugee resettlement organizations here in the United States. And our experience working with people who are new to the country, I was working in helping refugees find jobs at that time, and I would sit across the desk from someone who had just arrived in the country the day before, or a few days before, and I would be interviewing them to help develop a resume to begin the process of helping them find a job. And I would hear their stories, and I would hear about the skills and the things that they had been through, in their lives before war or persecution kind of erupted and forced them to flee. Hearing their experiences coming to the United States. And then I would work with them on the process of applying for a job, going to a job interview. And over again, was just met with the frustration of people who, they're qualified. I would sit there and I would talk with them very often in English and would understand everything that they were talking about and explaining to me. And would go to interview after interview and hear employers say, oh, they don't speak English. Oh, they're not qualified in this way. Sometimes, oh, they're overqualified. This is a position that we really want to offer to them. And so I think that Rachel and I both had that experience of constantly coming back from those kind of meetings and just saying, we wish there was an employer out there who would get it. An employer who would say, you know what, I'm going to open up opportunities, and I'm going to make this work. And so we kind of founded 1951 out of a desire to become one of those employers.
Yeah, thanks. So I work in a few different disciplines. I handle marketing for Akaya, the scale company. And I'm also a writer and a photographer for a few different companies. For Akaya, most people know me as the online voice, so social media, product launches, sponsorship programs, and things like that. And the values that Akaya holds are, there are three of them. One's collaboration, so that's a pretty big theme that's been going around all day today. And that's working with a lot of different companies to further the industry. There's also community, which is a huge one for us, and that's giving back into the professional community. And that doesn't mean just supporting these kinds of events. It also means the grassroots organizations that are all around, not just the US, but also the world. And then quality is the last one, and that's quality in products, quality in customer service. And what I wanted to talk about today, which we can go on into later, is that it's really important for me to be able to impact change where I can and have the most to impact in. And by that I mean, so when people think about Kaya as usually the scale, and they really want the scale, and since we give back into the community, we're able to control a little more on the events that we sponsor. So that means that we can say, if you want us to sponsor, you should pay attention to who your judges are and who's on your panels. So part of our policy is actually not sponsoring any events that have all men on panels or all men as judges in the latte art throwdown. And that seems really small, but when you're a new barista just going to your first throwdown and you see the MC and all three judges are men, it's really, what's another word for depressing? Like, it's sad. It's a barrier, it's a visual barrier, and it means that that community or whoever organized it didn't really think that women or non-binary people were important enough to judge or MC or organize. And then the other program that was started just 2 months ago is giving back to baristas who are competing. And I can talk more about that later.
Hi, everyone. Well, my background is kind of complex. I'm the Director of Sustainability and Impact for Da Terra Coffee, a coffee producer in Brazil, a farm. but also for a foundation called Educar Foundation. Both of them are almost 30 years old, but I joined them in 2003. They are both a family business. And why am I saying this? Because it are the family values that I learned from the foundation that was the base to develop Da Terra Coffee Farm, meaning that Da Terra was born as a project to be able to produce large volume of specialty coffee under social and environment practice in Brazil. And in order to make this dream happen, we based on our values and principles that we learned from our foundation and from our parent company, which was a retailer tire business in Brazil that back in the 60s was one of the first companies to have a bathroom for women and also allow women to dress in pants. So fast forwarding to Da Terra, Da Terra has many practices that we never thought about including because we always thought that that was the normal thing to do. So hire women, hire people of color, pay the same amount of money, take care of children, of employees, all that comes from our background, and we just included it in the business. So the question was, why not do that? Why some companies ask, why do you do that? And we say, why not? Because that really helps us make a better coffee and make a better coffee for a better planet. So we have, for example, 12% of our truck drivers are women. We offer we help with health. We give wedding gifts for the workers in the farm. And these are little things that represents what we think is the most important value, that is respect. It doesn't matter if it's a woman, if it's a woman, if it's a people of color or a homosexual, it doesn't matter. We value people that are working, that are committed, and are committed to our values. So the idea here is try to give example that is possible to do a good coffee production under very good values and still make money. However, it took us 20 years to actually be able to do profit sharing. For the first 20 years of our company, we decided to invest the profit into making this project successful. And I think this required a lot of resilience because it's really hard to prove that the model would work. But fortunately, it did. And I'm happy to share this project so more people can replicate that.
Yeah. So thinking about then the sort of sphere of influence of each of your businesses and the sort of privilege that you have within your space and with your employees or your project partners. You know, I'd really like to know from your perspective the type of influence that you want to have not only in your own communities, but you want to have in the broader coffee industry, right? And some of the barriers and challenges that you face as you are trying to engage with large organizations to help them change their sourcing practices or invest in certain programs or Doug to help placement for certain individuals that you think are ready to move on to a new business and trying to find placement for them and coming up to struggles there with other businesses. Same down the line, I would really love to hear how you engage in those difficult conversations and lead with your values that way.
you want me to go first?
Whoever wants to start. We'll make sure all of you get time.
I would say for us, very often when we are approaching other coffee businesses in our area, we very often approach it from first kind of talking about who we are and what we do. And I think that anyone running a business, especially we work largely with smaller independent cafes, everyone looking for the employees that they hire. They're looking for people that they can bring in that will be solid employees. They're looking for people who will stay for a while. And they're also looking to cut out as much risk as possible. And I think that's just inherent in someone who really cares about their business. They're trying to make sure that they succeed. And I think very often when we are approaching and talking about what we do, it is very helpful for us that we have a cafe where people who came to the U.S. as refugees are working. And it allows us the opportunity for us to say, come and visit our cafe, see what we're doing, see how we're doing it, and actually learn from our baristas how they're working with each other, how they're navigating their cultural differences, and allowing that to be an opportunity for people to come in and see a model where inclusion has moved beyond just putting someone in a space to say, okay, you're now a part of this. We've hired someone who's different from the rest of our staff, but where it's full-on participation in the operations of the company and the leading of the company, so that people can get a vision for, okay, this is not something that I have to be afraid of. This is something that actually can create opportunity for my company to grow beyond what it is today. So that's how we kind of initially approach it.
Okay.
The way we chose, because I think at the end it's a matter of what you choose to do. In the perspective of clients, we have a very, very good relationship with our clients because we've been trying and we try to develop a relationship that goes beyond price point. So I'm very happy to say that we have clients for more than 15 years, 12 years. And back then, when we started opening the commercial area of Da Terra, we chose only to find clients that would believe in sustainability. We would only choose clients that either had a certification or that were looking for a high-quality coffee. So we believe that by doing this, we extend that to that market. But looking internally, we live in Brazil, and we are a medium to large farm, but we belong to a country that has 287,000 smallholders producers. And all of them represents 40% of the coffee produced in Brazil. And the situation that they live in are very, very different to the situation I live, very similar to a lot of places in Africa, in Central America, and sometimes they are kind of hidden or forgotten because we are seen as a big country. So we challenge ourselves on how we could help the small producers. And we could buy from them and resell, but we chose to do something different that is in our essence, that is research and science. So we have a research very focused on microbiology of the soil that we hope that will help us to understand and to share this knowledge on how the land can still be productive so that in 2050 we will be able to be producing coffee, not only us, but everybody. And we also research about moisture measurement. So the connection between the producer and the buyer when they are discussing about moisture of the bean, it's well parameterized. So this is how we chose to extend our land from our country to our clients, pushing the inclusion of smallholder producers as well as our clients to fulfill the whole supply chain.
Jen?
So I've been with Akaya for over 3 years, and I've watched it grow from a little past Kickstarter stage to what it is now. And I think for anyone who's launching a business in the specialty coffee industry, connecting with the professionals inside is really strong. That doesn't mean just listening to opinions, but it also means supporting organizations and people. And the product sponsorship program that I mentioned earlier, I launched it 2 months ago, and it's global. And it's from 3 years of observing conversations around gender on the competition stage. And people have lectured about this, written articles, and it's all about there's bias on the judging table, maybe there's some bias in the competition rules themselves. There could be other barriers in place. So I can't really help much of that because I'm not a competitor. I'm also not a judge. But what I can help is in the products that people use. And since people already email asking for support pretty much every day, I thought having a sponsorship program where it will break down barriers for those people would help. So the sponsorship program is free product in exchange for promotion, basically. However, there are limits. You have to be one or more of several criteria, and that could be you're a woman, you're queer, you're ethnic minority, a refugee, a veteran, or disabled. Also, you're a first-time competitor, or your business isn't supporting you financially. So that covers a lot of ground, and that's a lot of barriers for competitors. And I'm really excited to say that just in 2 months, we're supporting 20 competitors around the world, and that's 13 countries. So that's really exciting because it means it's going out to a lot of different people who could use this, and the criteria doesn't mean that they need to win. I think that's something that sometimes gets lost in marketing, because in marketing you think, oh, I want to support the winner because they're going to talk about it all the time. But like all these people who win, they win because they have a whole team behind them, or they get support from their companies or all that. So if you can break down the barriers of maybe donating a little cash from your company, or supporting products, or even just, supporting a hotel stay for one person. It doesn't matter, it's small. And this kind of support builds up over the years, and people notice. It gives back to your company, and it's a form of marketing. But really, it's goodwill back into the community.
If we look at gender equity in coffee-producing countries and communities, but all the way up and down the supply chain, and we're really able to solve it, to really elevate the issue so that we can create better outcomes across the board for the sector. I think, really the sphere of influence for this work is the whole sector and all of us. I mean, gender is not only about women, females. It is about all of us in this room. It's about everyone in every community that we work with. And I think we, as the global coffee sector, we have huge aspirations and huge opportunities, not just to make the industry better for ourselves and our businesses and the people that we work with along our supply chain, but also set an example for other supply chains as well. Just that we can really be a leader in this issue.
So, everyone here is working sort of across international boundaries a little bit, right? And everyone's working with different languages, different cultures, different, on a more global scale, I guess, even if it's on sort of a local community level too. I would like to know how these conversations around that you see happening in the United States around marginalization, how these translate, and how you have conversations with people from different backgrounds that don't engage in the same sort of nuanced style of conversation as we do, and also what you would say to somebody that that doesn't believe, that doesn't value the work that you're doing at the same time. So those kind of two questions in one, but I say choose your own adventure. And then we'll close out that way.
I'll jump in. I mean, I think the key is really listening to where the other person is coming from. So first going in and trying to understand what are their concerns. So if you're talking to somebody in a particular position at a business, what are the things that they're trying to achieve, and be able to then respond to that in a way that brings in your own experience and also the voice of those people maybe that aren't in the room with you, but that can actually then translate into how the other person views the issue.
I think for us, very often when we talk with employers or we're talking with others, we end up very often talking about just making the cafe or the coffee company a more open space for everyone, not even specifically for refugees, but finding a way to get to the core of what must make your company, while at the same time looking at those areas where you can broaden maybe the rules or the ideals of your company to include people that have barriers that may not fit into the mold that you've set. And so kind of like whittling that down to where you have your essentials, but then you also have areas where you create a flexibility to bring people in and allow people to be a part of your company and feel like they belong.
So this is a huge challenge for me because it's part of my job to communicate across language and cultural boundaries. And you can probably tell from some of the language that's used on social media. It's a lot more simple. The words are written in a way that non-native English speakers can understand it, and the sentences are shorter. And so it's also the way that I wrote the product sponsorship policy and the general policies that we have, because I know that other languages don't directly translate some of the words that we use. Even just the words that Colleen had used earlier in the intro, that doesn't work in other countries. And that's actually why I was very explicit in some of my criteria, and why I have to keep amending what I say, because it's challenging, and it's a continual work. And in general, I think having any sort of diversity or inclusion policy, that kind of work isn't like a one and done kind of thing. You don't just write the policy and you're done. It's continual work. Like, do you have only white hands making coffee and black hands picking coffee? Maybe you should change that up. Is that something in your power to change? And if it is, think about changing that. So it's just small things that you can do. And if it's in your power, I would encourage you to change it.
I think it follows to understand what prevents other people into not doing something. And I think listening to their background and to their arguments would help a lot to find the right puzzle to unlock the system. But also thinking about the business, it's a matter of choice and purpose, as much as it looks very normal now, these terms, purpose. But it's a choice you make when you are starting a business. Am I going to be able to think more in a collective way or in a personal way? I'll be able to not to have profit for a certain time, certain amount of time into making a really sustainable farm. Am I able to do that? What I'm going to do with that? So I guess it's a matter of choice and purpose. And to convince other people is the first thing is to understand what would be preventing them not to be doing this. But above all, it shows there's a respect to understand the ecosystem too.
Thank you. Well, we're going to continue the conversation of having uncomfortable conversations after Michelle Johnson's talk. So, Isabella, will you join us for that second conversation?
Yes, sure.
Jen, Doug, and Kimberly? We have decided that in the concept of yielding space and allowing for more marginal voices, that Kimberly's going to sit this one out. So it's just an example to follow.